Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world and the burning issues of the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeing, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another week of Libertarian Angle.
It's great to see you and to be spending a little bit of time with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, if you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. We've got 30 years worth of articles and videos, other material there that present the principled and compromising case for the free society. Richard, with socialism being a big issue in today's world, not only here in the United States, but all over the world, and what seems to be an increasing popularity of socialism, which of course is contrary to everything we libertarians stand for, given our fierce commitment to freedom and free markets, I thought it would be helpful that we had a series of libertarian angles that discuss socialism, what it means, its philosophy, the principles, the origins, and then over a period of time apply what we've discussed to real-world socialist programs. So let's just start out with just the general theme of socialism. What is it? Is it an economic philosophy? Is it a political philosophy? I'll start out, but you're the economics professor, and you're certainly one who has steeped himself in socialism, given the fact that you're in what we call an Austrian economist or a free market economist. But the pure case for socialism, it seems to me, is one where the government owns everything for all practical purposes. I mean, people might own their own toothbrush or something in a socialist society, but by and large, all the businesses and all the homes are owned by the government, all the lands, the ranches, the farms, and so forth. I mean, it's just one great big government-owned enterprise where there is essentially just one employer, and that's the state. That's just mind-boggling. That imagine every single person works for the government. Everyone's a government employee. Everybody knows what his status is within the governmental structure. It's mind-boggling because we libertarians we Americans have grown up in pretty much a private property order. Government plays a massive role in our lives, but most everybody's got private jobs and private employers and so forth. I went to Cuba many years ago, and I'd studied socialism, but this was my first exposure to a real socialist society. It was just shocking. Walking down the street and knowing that every one of these operations was government owned. I remember going by a pharmacy and looking in, and it was just sort of dark, and the shelves were halfway bare, and there was a couple of people in there. But it just sort of like reminded you of the post office or something, and it just hit you. It's all government owned. Now, the question arises then is how do they fund this thing? Everybody's working for the government. Well, because the idea is that government is running enterprises and supposedly making money. Well, of course, that raises the other issue of calculation that you can talk about that arose many years ago, decades ago, called the socialist calculation debate. Is that in a free market economy, there's trades and exchanges taking place with prices, where people are able to evaluate whether to pursue one endeavor versus another endeavor because they compare prices and how much they value things. Well, in a socialist society where the government owns everything, there's no exchanges taking place. So the government runs everything. And so how do they calculate? Well, inevitably what happens is that all these government enterprises, they just start losing money. And we've seen this, for example, with oil companies in Mexico and Latin America, where the government owns the oil industry, and everybody thinks, panacea time because the government now owns the oil industry. Well, inevitably, owning the oil industry sends the government into bankruptcy. And we see it with Amtrak here in the United States, or the Postal Service. They're always losing money. So how does the government operate in a socialist society where there's no money-making opportunities? Well, inevitably, they have to end up letting a few people operate in the private sector in order to produce the wealth to fund the gigantic, massive government sector. And you see this, for example, in North Korea, where they have North Korean people going abroad and working in industries, and then the government seizes a large portion of their incomes to fund its operations. So it's a very destructive system. It certainly is one of the major causes of poverty in the world. I mean, it's not a coincidence that people in North Korea are extremely poor, or that people in Cuba are extremely poor. Now, granted, the U.S. economic embargoes against both countries accentuates the problem, but the core of the problem is a socialist system. We see this in Venezuela as well. So let me turn it over to you now, Richard, and see what your perspectives are on this. But to me, I just find it absolutely shocking that there is still so much support for a philosophy that is so economically bankrupt, not to mention morally bankrupt.
Well, I too had the opportunity to see socialism in practice in the last years of the Soviet Union. I was traveling there very frequently, doing consulting work on market reform and privatization, precisely because there were attempts, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, to allow degrees of transformation and economic change into limited private activities. And I too, if I can just give some examples to amplify what you were saying about, your surprise and shock when you were in, let's say, Havana. Opposite the Kremlin in Moscow, on the other side of Red Square, is a large multi-leveled building that we would call sort of an indoor mall. And while today, in the post-communist era of Russia, it has all the boutiques and stores and franchise businesses that you would find in Paris or London or New York. But during the Soviet time, this building, which I said is a three-story sort of indoor mall-type structure, was also all government owned, all government managed, all government supplied, all government provisioned. And you would walk in there, and 3 levels of shops and stores, and you would see, and all of these are government-run stores. So these are government retail stores with government employees as the salespeople. And you'd find some of them, everything was drabby, everything was dilapidated and paint peeling and not tended or cared for. But some stores were loaded with goods with no customers. It's clear that the central plan had failed to realize that these particular commodities were ones that consumers did not want, either in general or the size, the quality, the features, the characteristics. And then right next to it would be another store that would have an immensely long line, but very few things. The shelves barely empty. I remember clearly I was on the second level of this 3-story indoor mall structure, and I'm looking down and across to the other side, and on the second level there's this huge line of old women. What the hell is this? So I go down there, and it turns out to be a people's women's underwear store. And so I look around, and it's women's underwear. The problem is, you don't want capitalist wastefulness and duplication. One size fits all. Don't worry, comrade. Underpants don't fit. That's what safety pin is for. Adjust. You walk into other stores, and you'd find meat that was supposed to be like no pinkishness, all brown, and nobody wanted it. Shoes that were of shoddy quality, and nobody was interested in purchasing. The salespeople in these stores were lethargic, bored, impatient. You were an inconvenience, rather than what we take for granted in the West. The customer is always right, service with a smile, may I help you, what are you looking for? They would just stand around, and you were a nuisance. If you asked a question or wanted assistance, even with the meager things that they had, they would take it as an intrusion in their time and space. The other thing is that the shopping experience. We take for granted you go into the supermarket, right? You take your cart, you're going down the aisles, you take everything off the shelves that you need, and you take your shopping cart and you go to one of the checkout aisles. And there's usually several open. If there's, by the coincidence of the circumstances, a large crowd of customers and the lines at each register is getting a little bit long, if they have the staff, they immediately open an extra line or two if they have them, precisely to reduce the impatience and the wait time for the customer. In other words, everything is geared towards making life easy for the customer, finding what you're looking for, getting around the store, getting to the checkout line, and getting through the checkout line and out of the store as quickly and as expeditiously and as customer friendly as is possible. Now let me tell you about a Soviet socialist store, Jacob. Okay, comrade. It is time to go shopping. One wants loaf of bread. One does not have supermarkets in people's paradise of Soviet Union. No, there are retail people stores for every product. Walk down street with bag. Get to bread store. Go into bread store. Get online, Comrade Jacob. Get online. And you wait online to get to counter where bread may or may not be behind counter. Tell saleswoman, want one pumpernickel, one rye, assuming they have it. Now she gives you a ticket. You take this ticket and get on a second line. And you wait, and you wait, and wait to get up to what? The cash register. One cash register, regardless of how many people were in the store. And what are you doing here? Comrade, this is where you pay for the bread you want to purchase. Now you have receipt. You know what you do now, comrade? Get on third line. And you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And at this point, with the receipt, you now have the chance to pick up the bread in case it hasn't sold out by the time you've gone through the third line. Hello. But you probably heard proverb, comrade. Man does not live by bread alone. Now do you want meat, cheese, something to go with bread? You now have to go to the next people's retail store. For bread or milk. The meat store, whatever meager types of meats. So now you're trudging down the streets, right? Forget about cars. Only the party officials and an unbelievably small handful of taxis existed. You walk. Doesn't matter whether it's the heat of the summer or the frigid snowfall of winter. Here you are with your bags, and you trudge down street, looking for a next retail store, comrade. Not necessarily next door. So now you get to the meat store. What do? Line 1, tell person what you want. Line 2, go pay for it. Line 3, maybe pick it up. So now you have this bag. Out you go, trudging down the street again. Again, not necessarily next door, comrade. Dairy store. Line 1, line 2, line 3. This is how people live, Jacob. This was the workers' paradise. And what you also had is you would notice sometimes that something was going on in the back of the store. If a door to like the stock room was maybe a little open and you could look in, there people seem to be busy. Now, I know what you're thinking, Jacob. Well, they're checking inventory. They're about to fill the shelves again. Comrade, total misunderstanding. You must understand many dealings are what they in Russia called on the left. And this is not ideological. This means behind the black market, under the table. And there'd be a side entrance where if you knew the right people and you could give a little extra money, you could have almost anything you want by getting it from behind the counter in the back room, and therefore not only avoiding waiting on some of those lines, but also getting things that otherwise would not be available. That's how people live, Jacob. Day after day. And now you've bought your groceries to make, your dinner for tonight. Well, where are you going? You are going to your people's apartment. No private homes, no condos. What you had was a government-assigned apartment. What city you lived in, or town, or village, that was dictated as part of the central plan, where the government decides after high school or college or university graduation, where you will be assigned to work in a particular line of occupation, a particular state-owned enterprise, in a particular town or city. And therefore, you are assigned an apartment, not of your own choice. And furthermore, you have in your internal passport, that is your book document, a propiska. And what was propiska? This was your internal passport stamp of your residency permit. You could not live anyplace else. Not just a different town. You couldn't live in another apartment. So you're stuck there. Who cares for the building? The state. The dilapidated stairs. The smell of urine in the elevator. An elevator that may not work, so it's a 9-story building. Time for exercise, comrade. You got your bags of people's groceries. Now walk up 9 flights of stairs. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Big strong man now. Okay. I'm satirizing it, but imagine if this was your life day after day after day. Where you work, your chances for promotion. This isn't like, my boss doesn't appreciate me, and he hasn't given me a raise for 2 years. I'm going to go look for another job. There's going to be some boss out there who realizes I have better skills and is willing to pay me more. Forget it, comrade. Forget it. There's only one game in town, and it's the state. And therefore, you can only get promotions in your current position, and you could even be, and it could only be transferred to another enterprise or another town by the permissions of the planning hierarchies and the permissions of the supervisors of the state enterprise from which you want to leave and the state enterprise to which you wanted to go. And then the hassle of signing out of your state assigned apartment and finding a new state assigned apartment in a different location, whether it be the same city or another place in the country. It was much. Now, I'm not even talking about violation of civil liberties, no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion. Okay, we all understand a little bit about those kind of tyrannies in government-controlled societies. I'm here, Jacob, just thinking about everyday living. You wake up in the morning and you go to bed at night. What the hell is your life in between? Right, every day. And that was the reality. One more example, if you'll permit me. Long day of work. Couldn't get to go shopping. Maybe I go to people's restaurant. Forget it. First of all, they're few and far between. And then, since there's no profit to be made, no salary to be increased by serving the customers, you look in a window of a restaurant, right? A government-owned restaurant of one type or another, and you see tables are empty, but there are waiters standing around. You try the door, it's not open. You knock. I'd like to come in for a meal. Can't you see? We're full. Don't bother us. Now, of course, if you say, I would be extremely grateful. How grateful, comrade? Packet of rubles in hand, given to doorman and waiter, work miracles to come in. Now you open menu. Look at variety. Good thing I'm eating out. Better than cooking at home. You know what you find? The waiter comes. Of course, you've had to give him a few rubles too, so even pays attention to you. Well, I'll have that. Not available. I'll have that. Not available either. What about that? We haven't had that for years. What do you have? Borscht soup and cabbage. What an idea. I've been waiting all my life for it. That was restaurants in these. Now, were there good restaurants? Yes. Exclusively meant for foreigners who could spend dollars, or the party hierarchy. Now, add to that medical care, vacation locations, okay, access to health spas, anything like this, all dependent upon party position, hierarchy in the planning structures, and the favors and connections you had with those above and those who had to give favors to you from below, depending upon where in the hierarchy you fit. The classless society of the people's socialism was the most granulated and gradation system of class, caste, privilege, favor, burdens of dependency upon others that has ever existed in modern times. That was the reality of socialism on a day-to-day basis for the average person. They used to say in the Soviet Union, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Why bother? But that was daily life in these countries. And again, that's not yet talking about tyranny, lack of civil liberty, and so on. Just what, and now I'm just a fraction of this. I could go on and on of things that I saw, but that just tells about daily life. Now the question is, why? Why did they have this society? Why would you want such a society? And to be honest, Jacob, that requires us to go back both in terms of ideas and in fact in time. Where did this idea originate in like the real stream of human history? And to be honest, it goes back to the ancient Greeks and a particular thinker among the ancient Greeks, and that is the famous philosopher Plato, and especially in his well-known book, The Republic, his imagining of a perfect society. What do we discover there? And has been true ever since. The presumption that the collective, the group, the community comes before the individual. The individual is nothing. The group, the society, the collective, the tribe is everything. The individual lives and passes away. The community, the collective, the group, it continues intergenerationally. Who there and what there is more important, the whole or the part? The collectivist believes there is no existence outside of and independent of the collective, the tribe, the group. It is within which the individual is born. It gives him a sense of meaning and identity. It cares for him. It nurtures him. It gives him substance and a sense of value in his life because he is part of something bigger than himself and contributes to the survival and the continuance of the collective, even though he individually passes away and disappears from the community scene. Therefore, the individual is to be viewed as someone who is subservient to his values, his goals, his purposes are of no importance compared to the wider group. They must be sacrificed to the higher purposes of the group. His are petty. The interests of the community are ethical, moral, and necessity for human survival. Now, Plato then imagines this society in which there is one group in particular who live in communism. What does communism mean? No private ownership of virtually anything. And those are the guardians. They're the bronze people, they're the gold people. These are different people in the society. But then you have the warriors, and the warriors have to live in communism. Why do the warriors have to live in communism? The warriors, the guardians, they're to protect this imaginary perfect city-state from the aggressions of others in other parts of what today we call Greece. They must be concerned with the good of the whole, willing to fight for the group, sacrificing for the many if they must with their lives. Now, what would divert them from this? Plato says, self-interest, private property, family. So the guardians are brought up from their childhood outside of their own family. At birth, and when they're selected for these roles at a very early age, they're brought up in orphanages. They're educated and nurtured by the society as a whole, so as not to have a link to parents and to whom they would feel a loyalty, a responsibility, and a duty, and an interest. Then, when they're old enough and have been trained to be these warrior guardians, they live in common in military-type barracks. They dress alike. They eat commonly alike. Now, there are both male and female guardians. And guess what? Even in Plato's Republic, people sometimes find members of the biologically opposite sex interesting, if you get my drift. They can have intercourse, but if any conception occurs, the child is taken away from the guardian woman at birth to be brought up in an orphanage. Why? Because retaining and having a connection with her child will divert her attention from the interests and purposes of the group. Plato's presumption is that self-interest is something evil in the individual, and that it is cultivated. It is brought out as one of our behavioral characteristics by the institutional setting of private property. If we can eliminate this artificial and unnecessary and historically accidental institution of private property and put people in an environment of common sharing, common working, commonly dressing, no individual differentiation, then the individual's persona will be transformed. There is no given human nature. It is a malleable substance that the right institutional circumstances of collectivism versus private property individualism, and the right education, the indoctrination of teaching the person to only think of the group over himself, will transform human nature and the societal whole into this blissful communist society. It is that type of idea that originated most popularly in terms of the stream of Western ideas in Plato's Republic that has been the source and the basis of growth of socialism through the ages, and particularly its modern manifestation. I should point out one other thing, and that is the famous philosopher Karl Popper, in his book The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1945 and meant to be an analysis and critical rebuttal of the dangers of collectivism of his time, Nazism, communism, fascism, during those war years, highlighted that Plato was not only the father of communism, but of nationalism and fascism as well. Because the idea is that if the society is to be directed for the good of the whole, then there has to be a certain class, like the guardians, of philosopher kings, who will determine what will be done, each person's position in it. And there's a loyalty to the nation state, sort of a city-state nationalism, And therefore, Plato and the loyalty and the sacrifice for the city-state, which is sort of like your little city-state nation. And therefore, Popper argued that therefore Plato is not only the father of what we think of communism, but also of nationalism and fascism. Planning from the top, hierarchy of society, the leaders, the workers, the warriors, and that your loyalty is to the group, the city-state nation, and not to yourself or anything greater than that, such as humanity as a whole in the sort of the liberal sense of the individualist outlook. So that is the origin of this. Everything that has happened since, and particularly over the last 100 years, in these episodes of Soviet-style communism, National Socialism in Germany, in that racist or fascist nationalist form, all have their germ in this imagery and concept of human nature, the social, the society, and the role of the political authority that has its kernel in Plato. That is the beginning of all of it, and it runs through the history of the Western world, and is the disease that constantly is threatening to plague humanity because of appeal, persuasiveness, emotional attractiveness, and the failure to reason upon some of the very questions that you were mentioning earlier. Well, how do you plan? How do you calculate? How do you decide what the right thing to do? That's lost in all this. It's that broader thing of we're all in it together. All of us are more important than any one of us, and that is what we nurture and for which we must sacrifice.
Yeah, it's an excellent synopsis of socialism, its origins. I mean, the idea is that it really is that the government, the state, is everything. It is society, it is the people, and so it's not surprising that you get this nationalist type thing, because they conflate. I mean, the state becomes everything. You exist for the state. You're serving the state. You don't exist for your own happiness. Everything you do is for the greater good of the collective.
Yes.
You recited some examples from your experience in the Soviet Union. I had some of the same experiences when I visited Cuba. I asked a guy, I said, what happens if you dissent here? You say you're critical, and of course it's a criminal offense to question the revolution or the socialist system in Cuba. But his answer was very interesting. He says, well, there's one employer. He says, keep in mind, we all work for the state. And I said, well, so can't they just fire you and then you just starve to death? You can't go out and get another job like here in the United States. You get fired, you go find another job. Well, there's one employer. I mean, this is what's so shocking, that this is the reality. One single employer, and the employer is the government. And he said to me, he says, no, they're not that brutal. They will not, if you fall out of favor with them, they will not fire you where you just have nothing to eat at all and you just starve to death. He says instead, this guy was in his early 20s, he says instead what they do is what you suggested. They just transfer you to another department over on the other side of Cuba, where your girlfriend is here and you're way over on the other side of Cuba. And so if you want a relationship, you have to toe the party line. There was another funny incident where I was wondering how they got food, because as you point out, there's grocery stores, but only like for the foreign visitors, and where the grocery store is using dollars. Well, I knew that the average citizen was never in these stores. I would not see them, and the stores are few and far between anyway. In fact, I only saw one in Havana. So I asked a guy on the street, I said, where do people get their food? And he says, oh, have you been to a rationing station? And I said, no. And he said, would you like to go to one? And I said, yeah. So he starts taking me, winding through these neighborhoods of Havana. I didn't know where the heck he was taking me. But finally we get back into this sector where there's this rationing station where there's these government employees with these huge vats of beans and other things, where people come with their pails or whatever and they ladle in the amount of beans that they would be allocated. And that's how they get their food. That's how they allocate resources in a socialist system. You don't go out and buy it. They just say, here's your allotment of beans this week. Well, I started taking pictures of this. And one of the guys behind the counter says to my guide, he says, hey, they can't be taking pictures here. My guy says in Spanish, why not, comrade? Don't we the people own it? So there's kind of a disrespect for the system. Another incident I had shows the power of total control in a society like this. I took a cab to a town several hours away, and when I got there, I was looking for a room. There's no hotels at all. I mean, hotels are like, just a rare commodity. So there were none in this little village. And so where you would stay is in people's houses. They would rent their rooms out. This is part of that private industry that develops, that funds the state. Same with private little restaurants in people's homes where you would actually get some good meals. Well, I forgot my passport back in Havana, and they were terrified. Nobody would rent me a room. They said, no, you can't. They check us. They check us very carefully. If you don't have your passport, I can't rent to you. So I couldn't get a room. It was already getting late. And so finally I just offered a lady a generous bribe. And she took the bribe, but I mean, she was terrified. And she said, how do you expect to get back? And I said, well, I just, take a cab back. She goes, oh no. They have highway checkpoints where they're checking people's papers. If you don't have your papers, they will take you to jail. And I couldn't help but think about the highway checkpoints in the American Southwest as part of this immigration police state that we have, where they check your papers as you're going through these totalitarian-like checkpoints. So this is what life is like. I mean, we're talking about the pure socialist ideal. Government ownership over the means of production, government ownership of the results of production, government ownership of people. Where the government owns everything. It owns the resources, it owns the people, and everybody serves the greater good of the state. Now,
Right.
obviously, there's not a lot of societies like that in the world. I mean, China used to be like that pretty much, but then they started loosening up on government controls. But we still have North Korea, we have Cuba, Venezuela is essentially along those lines. So what we'll do from in subsequent sessions of Libertarian Angle is to examine socialist systems that are not completely socialist. And I think this is what gets Americans all off base, is that they think that because their society is not totally socialist like Cuba or North Korea, that they must have a free enterprise country, or that like China is often now referred to as a free enterprise country. Well, this is nonsense. And I think that's what we need to be examining as we move forward, is that the deleterious effects of socialism affect not only the pure ideal socialist society, but also the society that have embraced in a massive way socialist principles in their economic system.
Yes, and I think that part of this is understanding that there's only one thing that can break this spell of the attractiveness of these collectivist and socialist ideas. That, as I suggested, can be traced back to Plato, for instance, and that is the way to break that spell is to insist upon and challenge, the idea that the individual is the focal point, that he is the one who should be free, and that force and compulsion and compulsory sacrifice for the collective is itself the immorality in this philosophy. Until we are able to break the spell of this belief that the group comes before the individual, and that he must sacrifice for the collective, this train of thought will continue, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about that strain of the argument in these future discussions as well.
Okay, on that note, we'll wrap it up. We greatly enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to more discussions along this line of socialism, both here in the United States and the rest of the world. And Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Okay, and until next time.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Again, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. Thank you, and we'll see you all next week.